Hi, I'm Clara, and this is the Practice with Clara podcast, where we go into philosophy and all things yoga related, which has been my passion for the last 20 years. This week's episode is all about the sixth chakra, known as the third eye center. We go into the themes, what it means when it's in balance and out of balance, and we talk about our own experience with connecting to our wisdom and our intuition. We hope you enjoy this week's episode, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Practice with Clara podcast. You're sitting with Stephanie.
And Clara.
For today's episode on the sixth chakra. So we've been beginning every one of our talks with a quote from the book by Anodea Judith.
Called The Wheels of Life.
Called The Wheels of Life. And here's this week's. In order to see, you have to stop being in the middle of the picture. Look at all of the objects themselves. Look at all of the relationships, not just the things, to see the world as a whole, and to reach within our minds directly and clearly for the information we want. The more clarity we have within ourselves, the better we're able to see the subtle properties of the world around us.
One more time.
In order to see, you have to stop being in the middle of the picture. Look at all of the objects themselves. Look at the relationships, not just the things, to see the world as a whole and to reach within our minds directly and clearly for the information we want. The more clarity we have within ourselves, the better we're able to see the subtle properties of the world around us.
So sixth chakra is located the third eye center, which is if you were to draw a line from one temple to the other, and then from the middle of your forehead to the back of your head where those two lines intersect is where the third eye center is. And the third eye center, at least with this quote, has a lot to do with intuition, wisdom, kind of beyond reason into a deeper knowing. And so what I love about the quote that you just read is this idea that you need to see the bigger picture, that you need to see each of the objects. And so what that makes me think of is kind of stepping outside of your experience and kind of looking at it from an objective point of view versus a subjective point of view. And that, I think, connects us to our wisdom, right? This space beyond our story. What would you?
Yeah, and I love this quote for that reason, and also that it's talking about the relationships between things. So instead of examining, like, you're Clara, and I'm going to assign labels to you, yoga, mother teacher, dark-haired, yogi, right?
Yes.
I'm going to look at how you relate to the world around you. So what is your relationship to me? How do you interact with different things? And I think adding kind of another dimension to the way we look at the people in our lives, the events in our lives, gives us more clarity as a whole. So then, for example, if you're viewing a popular celebrity or politician, instead of identifying with them in their authority figure,
yes,
you start to observe what kind of language are they using? What are their interactions like in the media versus, say, Twitter versus behind the scenes when they think no one's watching, right?
Yes.
And that's the danger that we have when we start creating, identifying with people based on a certain role they play instead of looking at all the different textures of how people present themselves.
I'm just chewing on that.
Yeah.
It's a good one. It's a tall ask, is what I was just thinking, because and this is why it's so high up in terms of the chakras. We're getting into this. We're essentially kind of in the space of wisdom. So you need to kind of step back and see the bigger picture, which is it's a tall ask.
And I think the other piece of this that I love is they're speaking to clarity we have within ourselves. The better we're able to look at others and the properties of the world. So that, to me, kind of works upwards from all the other chakras. You've built your creativity, your confidence, you've come into the heart for forgiveness, the throat's expression. And then third eye is kind of connecting all of those pieces together. So you have a seat of confidence, and then you're not looking at people and idolizing them or creating stories about them. You're being really honest. And also your perspective of yourself and the way you interact. You're no longer shying away from, this is something I did, but you're divorcing yourself from it, kind of splitting your personality. You're embracing more of the shadow aspects of the world.
Where do you feel like, or when do you feel like you've been able to do that?
Which aspect?
The aspect of being able to kind of, let's first talk about ourselves. So when you're able to kind of see yourself in your totality and kind of, yeah.
I think that's an ongoing process. And I think it takes a lot of emotional maturity to look at people for who they fully are instead of picking out the parts that serve you.
Yes. And so, but because we always ideally want to start with ourselves, and then through the inner work that we do, then we're able to kind of allow that to spill over into our relationships. So in your own life or your own journey, where do you feel like, or when do you feel like that's happened for you?
I know I idolize people and create stories around them and kind of give them a lot of control per se over me. Like I've given them that because it's the way I've chosen to view whoever it is. And I've had people in my life say to me, you're not seeing things as what they are. Like you've chosen to see a very small snapshot of who this person is. And because of how much adoration and reverence and respect I have, I'm missing all of the other stuff. And then I turn it back on myself and go, okay, well, you're not good enough. Like this person is way smarter than you or disciplined or whatever it is. So that's been that's been really difficult. I'd say the last 10 years is viewing in the past how I've done that. And even now when I'm like, okay, check yourself.
Yes.
We're all human.
I just, this week, I just got into, Jada Pinkett Smith has a show on Facebook called The Red Table Talks.
I love her.
Oh my God, I love her. So it's just interesting that we bring this up. So I'm just going to, it's a great show to watch when you are pumping breast milk.
And how often do you do that?
Yeah, every day. And so she had Alicia Keys on at some point. I just watched it this week. But one of the things that I really, that is speaking to me about what you're saying is that Alicia Keys became, I think she dropped her first album when she was 18. And from 16 onward, she was performing. And so because she was so young and wanting to please, she essentially her personality, or who she became, was all the things that people wanted her to be or said that she was. And it took I don't know how many years. I'm going to say probably in her 30s, or maybe when she became a mom. She didn't actually give us a timeline, but she stepped back and she was like, who am I? Because I actually don't know who I am, because I'm just the amalgamation of what people are telling me, which I feel like is kind of similar to what you're saying. Yeah. And it's not connecting to it wasn't Alicia. And she says this, I wasn't connecting to myself. I didn't know who I was. I didn't even know what I looked like, because the question kind of came up of like, I don't remember, maybe a decade ago or a little bit less, she stopped wearing makeup to like red carpet events, and there was like this whole
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, there was a whole like uproar in the fashion community around that. And for her, she was like, I don't even know what I look like without makeup, because I've been wearing makeup since I was 16, that I couldn't recognize my own face. Like if I didn't have makeup on and I passed the mirror, I was surprised at who I saw, because I didn't recognize that person. So she's like, I had to go on this very deep dive of who am I? Which is, to me, coming back to the sixth chakra, is connecting to this inner wisdom. And so you have to stop listening to the people around you in order to figure out, who am I? Right?
Yeah.
And so I really, really loved how she shared that. And it really made me reflect. One of the things that she said is, she's like, I'm a fixer. Like, when I come into the room and, things feel uneasy, I'm trying to figure out a way to make it better. And I totally relate to that. Like, I've been a fixer in my family and in my relationships with my friends and community. Is like, I come in and I'm like, how do I fix this? Right. And something that I'm kind of learning right now in my partnership is to not fix and to just quite simply be in the discomfort. I'm kind of going off topic, but I just think this is kind of interesting, just in terms of my own reflection of, can I not try to change anything in this moment and just be in it, right?
And what's shifted for you in your relationship given that observation?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, what's been so cool for me is how uncomfortable that is. Like, how uncomfortable it is to not try to change what's happening. And hold on, I'm just going to keep going with that, because when I'm by myself and I'm in discomfort, I'm totally fine. Like, I can be uncomfortable and I won't try to change it. But if it's happening with another person where they're in discomfort, I automatically am like, how do I fix this? Like, I'm figuring out solutions for them. And they haven't even asked me for solutions. But generally people are super stoked about the solutions. But in the relationship I'm in right now, right, my partner is asking me, don't change anything, just be here with me. And I'm like, what does that mean? Right? So it's so now I'm sitting with, in that moment, how do I take care of myself, right, versus the other person, and what's arising for me. So I feel like I'm connecting to my sixth chakra right now in this example that I'm giving you, a long-winded and now here we are kind of thing. And so I feel like you said it as well, is like the way that you connect to this wisdom is you have to be quiet and you have to stop doing. Right?
And that's uncomfortable.
So uncomfortable. That's why it's such a tall ask. I'm back to.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about this, just because part of the being in your intuition and sitting in your own discomfort and kind of becoming more aware of what's coming up internally, the senses that come up, or then, I don't know if you ever had it, but that kind of shattering moment where you see things differently all of a sudden because you've been in your own sixth chakra, let's say, then you can't unfeel or unsee what's happened. So my question for you is, can you give an example of when that's occurred for you?
I will give the example, but it also makes me think of, I don't know. Did you ever watch The Matrix? Oh, yes. We talked about this. Oh, yeah. We talked about this. You were watching it. So it always makes me think of the blue pill versus the red pill.
Yes.
So if you're unfamiliar with The Matrix, Neo, our main character, essentially has this moment where he is given the option to see the truth, right? And that is, I think, the blue pill, or to go on being in ignorance, and that's the red pill. Yeah. Now, the thing is that if you take the blue pill, you can never come back. You can never unsee what it is that you saw, right? And so, he has this dilemma for a good 30 seconds or what have you of like, ignorance can be bliss. Do I want to stay ignorant or do I want to go deeper? And I feel like we all come to that. Yeah. And that's what you're asking. We all come to that moment at some point in our life or in our practice where we're like, okay, I'm about to jump off this cliff and see things or experience things, but I'm never going to be able to go back, right? And so I think that, okay, here we go. I think that, I had to think about when that was, and what's showing up for me is I used to study martial arts in the bottom of the Grand Canyon every year with my teacher, Constantine Darling, and there was about between 20 and 30 of us who would live down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon for 10 days, and we would do martial arts, okay? Now, there was one day every time, we always go down to this place called Beaver Falls, which is like, it takes about 6 hours to hike down, and then 6 hours, it takes about 2 hours to hike down, but we stop at all these beautiful whirlpools and waterfalls and things like that. So it would take us about 6 hours to get down there and a couple hours to get back. So that day, everybody dropped LSD. And I wasn't going to, but the friend that I was with had never done it before, so I felt like I needed to support and be there for him because I had done it so many times when I was a teenager, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna take care of my friend here and drop this LSD with him. So we start going down, and we're having the best time. It's like it's amazing out, and it's really hot. It's probably like 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and very, very dry heat. And we get to a point where I haven't been paying attention, but all of a sudden I see my teacher, and he drinks water, and I look at him, look at his bottle, and look worried. Like he's not going to have enough water, because there's no water, there's no fresh water anywhere that you can fill up your bottles with. And so I was like, oh, how much water do we have? And I look, because we've been drinking water, and my friend and I both had bottles that we were sharing, and we had probably, like, out of a 1.5 liter, we probably had a good quarter left for 2 people, and we haven't even gotten to Beaver Falls, let alone come home.
Oh
okay.
God.
And then all of a sudden I start going down the rabbit hole of, we don't have enough water, I'm going to dehydrate, I'm in the middle of the Grand Canyon, I haven't taken care of myself, and I start to freak out. And I freak out in my head for a good, what feels like 15 minutes, which is probably about 30 seconds in real life. And while I'm having this freak out, my friend, who I'm quote unquote babysitting, is in the pool of water, and he's actually having his own matrix experience where he actually sees the matrix. He sees, he's having this beautiful kind of connection with the eternal consciousness. He's that's where he is. And he comes back, and I'm like, I need to go right now. And he's like, okay. I was like, I need to go back right now. We don't have enough water, and it's 3:00 in the afternoon, and the sun's not going to set for a long time. And he's like, okay, no problem. And I will just say that the trip home was probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life.
You did it by yourself?
No, we all did. We walked back together.
Okay.
But he ended up having to take care of me, which is the hilarious part about all this. He had to babysit me because I was in full-blown freak out about the fact that I was going to die. And that what was going on in my mind was that I didn't take care of myself. I'm being irresponsible. There used to be a show in the 80s called Rescue 911. I was like, I'm going to be on Rescue 911 because, here's this stupid girl who's decided to drop LSD in the desert, doesn't have enough water, and is dies of dehydration. So I'm going through all of this judgment within myself. And in the same breath, I'm also dealing with my own mortality. And, I can't pull myself out of it. I am so deep in it, okay? Needless to say, we get back to where we are. I drank 2 liters of water, without stopping for, and I think peed forever. I'm still alive. Everyone's still okay. But what arose around that is the next morning I woke up and I had this really intense crisis about the fact that I've been practicing yoga and meditation for, at that point, maybe 9 years. And when push came to shove, meaning when something arose that was very intense, instead of meeting it with all the work I had done, it felt like I wasn't that I'd forgotten all the things that I had done to work towards this. And so I had that moment where I was like, why do I practice yoga? Why am I doing this if when shit hits the fan, I'm freaking out? I can't. It was such an interesting time. So then I went to my teacher and I said, this is what happened for me yesterday. Because I didn't tell anybody else except my friend that all of this was happening in my mind. So I went to my teacher the next day, later that day, and I said, I haven't been practicing yoga, because if I had, wouldn't I have been able to handle this and be okay, if I'm going to die, that accepting that and going through that. Yeah, exactly. Not going into full blown and so what had happened in that moment was there was a very strong disconnect with my wisdom, with my inner knowing, right? I was fully in what we would say the first chakra, right? I was fully in survival mode, and I couldn't rise up to connect to my wisdom. And my teacher said, And now the practice begins, because now you know what's at stake if you don't do your practice. Okay. And we do it so that when we are connecting to those moments of mortality, or those moments where we might, where the fear is so strong it takes us over, then we are like, okay, we have to remember that we still have that wisdom.
Yeah.
And so it was, so needless to say, that was like the boot camp for me to remember. And I feel like I have since then, when I'm in a moment of crisis or deep panic, to step back and take a deep breath and meet it, right? Instead of reacting. And so, but that was like, I feel like that was the strongest point in my life when I was like, okay, like my dad used to say, like, the practice doesn't begin until you're running, screaming with your hair on fire for your life. Now now shit gets real, right? And so that was my moment of running with my hair on fire. So that hopefully, and I feel like since then, I've been able to meet the challenge without, like losing my absolute shit. I mean, I have moments where I lose my shit for sure, but like I'm able to come back faster to my center point.
Do you think like having that occurrence, like what shifted afterwards for you? Like, was that a major turning point in how you developed your career as a yoga teacher and how you developed your own practice?
It didn't have anything to do with my career, but it had to do with my connection to myself. And like, we know this, and I had to be reminded, and I feel like the practice is constantly, you're actually working on the exact same thing over and over again, but it's just more, my therapist likes to say, you're dealing with the same thing, but it's just more and more subtle, okay? So that was like the grossest point of that crisis for me, and I'm still dealing with it, but it's way more subtle than it is, that I'm going to die of dehydration. Like that's, needless to say, I always carry a ton of water wherever I go from here on out, always. But, it was definitely a moment of crisis, but it solidified how important it is for me to remain connected to myself. And once I start to feel like I'm moving out of that, then I need to like
bring it back
and get quiet to listen to that, to listen to that wisdom, because I wasn't quiet. I was like full blown survival mode. Right.
Yeah.
So, when we're in that mode, you just need to take care of yourself, and then you do the work.
And what does stepping back look like for you now? Like when you feel like you're in that kind of a pressure situation?
Yes. I have to stop talking. Like literally stop talking. Get really, really quiet in myself, no matter what's happening around me. And I need to kind of step back with a scientific mind and observe myself without doing anything. So I'm like, okay, I am full blown freaking out right now. And this is the emotion that's coming up. And this is how I'm feeling. And kind of naming all of it and stepping back from it to recognize that this will probably change in about 15 minutes. So I just need to watch it until then.
Because the emotions are so strong.
Yes.
So this brings me into the Yoga Sutra I wanted to discuss. And we're bringing up the Yoga Sutras because so many community members inquired about the Yoga Sutras and asked for Clara and I to discuss them.
So we'll just give a story about, the Yoga Sutras is one of the oldest, I'd say it's one of the oldest texts that we as modern day yogis read. It's by a person called Patanjali. There's debate on whether or not he wrote it and whether or not he actually existed, as with all things. But essentially, it is a how to. It's a how to do meditation in order to connect with your higher self or your inner wisdom. What we're kind of talking about now in terms of sixth chakra. So all of the sutras, meaning all of the lines in them, are kind of like how to meditate, how to connect to self.
So this is Yoga Sutra 2.6. It's around the ego. False identification is confusing the nature of the seer with the nature of the instrument of perception. In other words, false identification happens when we mistake the mind, body, or senses for the true self.
All right, do it again.
False identification is confusing the nature of the seer with the nature of the instrument of perception. In other words, false identification happens when we mistake the mind, body, or senses for the true self.
Okay, so one of the big things that Patanjali writes about is in the Yoga Sutras is kind of ways that we essentially are connecting to Maya, meaning illusion. So a large part of the practice, the idea of connecting to big S self or our consciousness or the space that actually lives in the third eye center is because we are an illusion. We're not seeing the truth for the way that it is, meaning that we're hanging out with the red pill and not the blue pill.
Yeah.
So if we're going back to the Matrix term.
I love it.
And so this idea of false identification, right? So I kind of brought it up in this last story that I talked about is like a lot of the yogis believe like we are not our mind, our body, or our senses because those are constantly in flux. And so what we're looking to connect with is the part of ourselves that is unchanging. And so in Patanjali's words, this would be capital S self, where lowercase s self would be our ego. And ego in this definition would be who we think we are, our thoughts, our emotions, right, our bodies. And that never, if we remain connected to our little s self, right, we're constantly in reaction versus response, meaning that we're not connecting to the wisdom, the greater wisdom that lives inside of us. We're constantly in survival. And so ego lives in the first chakra.
Yeah.
And so the idea of the union between the two is like to connect that small s ego self, right, with our wisdom, big S. Okay. And so it's an interesting one because generally we think that we are our emotions. We think that we are our thoughts because that's how we identify ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we identify ourselves with, we have context of connecting or referring to the outside world, and that gives us a context of who we are, right? Yeah. And so it's a very intense.
And I like this because it brushes up against the quote I originally read around clairvoyance, intuition, mm-hmm. and being in that deep seat of clarity. And then on the opposite end is the ego and Maya, the illusion that we project out onto the world. Like, I am this thing, I am this thing. But the danger in that is if you're identifying so much with who you think you are, it becomes harder to let go of those things. So if you're identifying with, this is who I am in relationship to this other person, well, maybe you stop viewing the relationship for being loving, supportive, all the things that a relationship should be, instead of seeing yourself up against this other person in terms of, well, this is my partner, who am I without that thing? So the quote that I started with is viewing things in terms of your relationship to them. And then even in how I would think of it is like the virtues that you want to express, or as in like living with the yamas and the niyamas. So am I compassionate? Am I patient? Am I humble? Like, those are things that we can all identify with and share, as opposed to like, I'm a white 30-something female who enjoys yoga and writing. Like, all of that is going to change. Well, maybe not my skin color, but
well, and more so than kind of riffing on that is that we are those things, and we are, like, so what it's asking of us to be is fluid.
Yes.
And so not identifying, so instead of saying like, I'm an angry person, I feel angry right now.
Yes.
Or right now I can't be loving, or right now I am loving. But instead of saying I am loving, it's right now I'm loving, so or in this moment.
You're talking about the behavior instead of the person.
Yes. And identifying with the fact that it's what's real in this moment, but it may not be real later.
Yeah.
Right? You might be a yogini now, somebody who practices yoga, and you might not be in 2 years. You might be something else, right? And as Steph is saying, when we attach ourselves to our identity, it stifles our growth. because we don't allow ourselves to go what my dad likes to call past the village compound, meaning you don't go outside of the comfort zone of what you know to be. And what this practice is asking for is to continue to go out and to assume that nothing is the same in this moment.
And another question then from me to you would be, when have you been in that weird kind of crux where your ego is battling your intuition, where you're really sitting in something? Yeah.
I think the most recent event that happened would be around my child. And last week, the other thing that I tend to do when I breastfeed or when I pump or breastfeed is that I do a lot of Googling. And Google can kind of take you... Google is not necessarily the best oracle, as we like to call it. And so I was Googling about breastfeeding or how much milk she should be having. And and then I was Googling about sleep training because she's coming into her 4 months. And so I felt like I needed to, figure out about sleep training. And then all of a sudden I got into my head about the fact that I'm not doing what all these things are telling me to do, like how you're supposed to put them down and da-da-da-da. And I... for the rest of the day, I couldn't put her down properly. I couldn't feed her properly. I couldn't, because I was so in my head about what I thought I should be doing. Yeah. And I couldn't intuit what she needed because I wasn't there. And that was so interesting because then I think I texted a mother friend of mine and she was like, stop reading. Like, you know what to do. And I was like, you're right. Like for the last 3 days, I've put her down when she needs to be put down. I've fed her when she needs to be fed. But all of a sudden, I, after reading all this, got into my ego about being like, oh, how should I be doing this? And that to me is like the biggest example where I stopped connecting to my wisdom. Like we know what it is we need to do if we listen. Yeah. But there can be such a large moment of self-doubt. And doubt is an interesting one. It's a good attribute to have, actually. Like, one thing I love about the Jewish faith is that they ask you to doubt. They ask you to question. It's really important because when you do that, then it really solidifies what you believe in. Yeah. So I needed to go out of my wisdom and kind of like, have this like, whoa, am I doing everything right? To realize like, no, I don't. Yeah. Stop Googling, Clara. Yeah. Like, just stop Googling. Go back to reading New York Magazine and stop Googling. Because if I just listen and be present, most of the time I know what it is that needs to be done.
It's like when you use WebMD if you're not feeling well, and then everything's worst. Like, you're going to die, you have cancer. Yeah, it's like, just don't go there. Yeah. And you nick your finger and it's like, that's cancer.
You're like, definitely, or you're like, oh my God, this is definitely an infection. Right, it's gangrene, I'm going to have to get this amputated. I totally get it. So I put it out to you in terms of when was the last time that you kind of battled between your ego and your wisdom?
Well, mine is kind of, this recent one is unresolved. Like, I'm still sitting in my own literal physical discomfort. My stomach gets really upset when I'm anxious. And I usually, like, all week, I'm like, I need to stop eating dairy. And I'm going through all the dieting things. And I'm like, maybe I'm like exercising too hard in the sun, so my stomach is upset. No, like, of course it's not any of these, like, maybe small parts of it, but no. And last night I was just like, did my own, like, drew a tarot card and meditated and lit incense and just cried really hard at one point and just sat in that sticky kind of grossness that we need to go through to get closer to ourselves. I have an idea of why I'm anxious, but I haven't fully landed on it. But it's, for me, the ego shows up when it's like, oh, to stop eating cheese.
It's obviously cheese.
It's just cheese. Yeah. Like, it's just cheese. And then the other part of me is like, no, like, It's not what you're eating. You need to slow down. I hate slowing down. My big thing, like I can slow down to read, no problem, and write. But whenever things start coming up, it's when I start getting busy, as I'm sure lots of people do.
Yes.
So to be determined on what it is, which is fine. I don't need the answer right away, but the ego is like immediately goes to all these stupid, like the false identification that the Sutra talks about.
Yes.
Is all these things you can point at, which usually it never is.
No.
Yeah.
No. To kind of tie it all back in is in order to connect to our sixth chakra or the work that we do around that, and hopefully you're kind of intuiting it by what we've been talking about or kind of figuring it out, is that you need to get quiet. Mm-hmm. You generally need to get still, like some people find them it's meditative to do something that's repetitive, can work, but you need to stop going out and you need to go in.
Yeah.
And so that's that is the most direct way to connect to our intuition, to connect to our wisdom, to connect to our innate knowing. And a great indication and Steph, you brought it up so beautifully, like a great indication when you know you're kind of in your little s self, meaning in the survival mode, is generally you make yourself very busy. So all of a sudden, if you're like, whoa, my schedule just got ramped up, then at least for me, I'm like, oh, something. There's something here that I need to pay attention to that I'm trying to run away from. Because what the ego is going to do in terms of this context is it's going to keep you alive. Like that's its job. It's a really important job to have. And so slowing down might mean that a part of you is going to shift, right, and change from it. And the ego doesn't know whether or not that's going to keep us alive. And so we go with status quo. We keep going as we know it works, or we keep doing what we think is working. And that's the job of the ego.
And don't you think too, just with everything happening in the world right now, we're all being tasked with slowing down, that this is the work of the sixth chakra, is like coming into that awareness?
Yes. And yes. In some ways, yes. I feel like there's a lot to unpack in terms of what's happening right now in terms of COVID and pandemic and apocalyptic situations in particular parts of the world. For those of us who are fortunate and privileged enough to not have to worry too much about getting COVID, then we have this opportunity to not be in survival and to slow down, because there's two things happening. Like there's definitely, I feel like there are moments with everybody, and there was definitely moments here in BC, and I feel like we might be going through another wave again, but like when everybody had to stay inside, and when you saw people, they were definitely in first chakra survival mode, because we were literally not sure. Everybody was the enemy.
Yeah.
So if you're able to step back from that and move out of that and have this time at home and isolate and get quiet, then we have that opportunity to also connect to our inner wisdom and our inner listening. And so many people have spoken about that in terms of, in our community, about how this has been an amazing time for them to slow down and reflect on what's important. And I remember talking to a friend of mine and her saying, like, I haven't eaten dinner with my family this much. We haven't all been together this much. And I realized that this is really what feeds me. And so, yes, if you're not in a place where all you need to do is survive, if you're able to shift out of that, then I think this is an opportunity to connect to our wisdom.
Before we close, just to give a little bit more of a broader overview of the sixth chakra. So it's themes, imbalances, and blockages. Clara, if you want to give just a little brief overview of those three pieces.
So obviously the biggest theme that we've been talking about is intuition, inner knowing. The third eye is also known as like where the pineal gland is. It's also known as Brahman's cave, and that is, they say, the connection to universal consciousness or to God. And so that would be another theme that you could talk about, is what is your relationship to divinity, or your relationship to your own wisdom, or to the collective consciousness. So those would be themes that you could talk about when there's an imbalance in the sixth chakra. It goes one of two ways. Like if the sixth chakra is too open, then you're generally not grounded and you lose all sense of who you are, and you're essentially in the ether. And so that's a person who can't focus. It's a person who doesn't have a sense of what's really going on. They don't
like
know
being
what's
on
happening.
LSD.
Totally like
So
being
I'm thinking
on LSD. Exactly. Though sometimes when you're on LSD, you're actually very, very connected to all things and all beings. It depends on where you are on your LSD trip. But I'm not condoning you should do LSD. Let's start there. And then the blockage around that is that you can't hear or feel your own wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that way, you're just literally running around in your ego, meaning the survival part of yourself, and you don't know what it is that you need. And then the other part of that is also when it's closed is that you can't see the bigger picture, right? Alan Watts talks about this being like the bug's eye view versus the bird's eye view. The bug's eye view is the idea that all you can see is what's directly in front of you. You can't see the bigger picture. And kind of Anadea Judith goes into it in the quote that Steph just started this podcast with, of like, look at all the objects in the room, everything. And when we're in a bug's eye view, we can't see all the things. We can only see the thing directly in front of us. So that would be a blockage. And so ways of connecting to the third eye center is generally it's meditation. And what I would recommend is what we call Jiva Bandha. If you're doing a yoga practice, you take the tip of your tongue and you take it to the roof of your mouth, essentially where the top palate meets the back of your front teeth, and you put your tongue very gently there. It creates kind of a soft opening of the jaw. It relaxes the jaw, but it also connects us to and activates the third eye center. The other thing that you would do is do a lot of meditation around the third eye center. So those would be, I think I got through everything.
Yeah,
did I get through everything?
Did. That was great.
Do you want to add anything to any of that, themes or?
No, you covered that.
Okay.
Beautifully.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today out there. We really always appreciate you. And thank you to our Facebook community on the Practice with Clara community page. It's been really great. There's been some really good questions. And if you ever have questions for us that you want us to go into here on the podcast, you can post it there. Always a joy to sit with you, Steph. And we'll see you next week. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Today's podcast was brought to you by the Practice with Clara app. That's mine. I've created almost 100 yoga classes for you to do at home or on the go. And they're available to you on your favorite device, including mobile, desktop, and TV. These classes include vinyasa, slow flow, hatha, restorative, yin, mantra, meditation. I also just had a baby, so I created prenatal yoga for all 4 trimesters. So head over to clararobertsoss.com/join to learn more. Or search for the Practice with Clara app at your favorite app store. There's a 7-day free trial, so no commitment. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast. We've got lots of good stuff in store for you. Until next time, namaste.